Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Based on the few emails I've had in the last couple of weeks or so, I thought it was time that I showed some of the shortcuts that I use on the table saw, so let's just dig in. The most common shortcut I use are these little measuring blocks, and they're about 4 inches long, and they're square, and they come in 1/16, an 1/8, quarter, 3/8, and half. And I use these all the time for setting the height of my table saw blade, but I also might use them for measuring the width. So if I'm cutting something that's fairly narrow, I will use it and set the width right there. Super handy little things, probably one of the most used tools in my workshop. The other thing that I use quite a bit are these homemade measuring blocks, and you can see that I have 4 inch on one side, 2 on another. Those are common dimensions that I use, and this one is 1 1/4 by 2. So if I want to make something that's 1 1/4 inch wide, maybe I'm working on some table legs or something, it's just as easy as that. The other thing, both of these are exactly 3/4 of an inch, and my measuring blocks only go to a 1/2 inch. So now I can also use them to set the depth of my blade if I need that. Super handy, just from some scrap hardwood, and I put magnets on the back so these live on the side of my table saw, so I always know where they are. You can see that how they click onto the tabletop here from the magnet. Really easy thing to make. One of the questions I got recently was using circular saw blades on the table saw. And circular saw blades, of course, are typically used in circular saws, but because the arbor size is the same on a table saw as it is on a circular saw, you can use this blade, at least in North America, you can use this blade on your table saw. They're interchangeable. The only disadvantage with this is, of course, you don't have the height. Here I have a 10-inch blade, and this is a 7 1/4 inch blade. The reason I would use this, there's many different reasons. The first one, this will give me a rougher cut many times than what I might have in here. But if I'm breaking down wood, hardwood especially, and I need more power than what my circular saw can give me, then I would resort to putting one of these in my table saw. You can see this is a 24 tooth. This is typically a rough cutting, like a house construction type blade that you would be using, but in the table saw it works just fine, and it does a really good job. You can also get a 40 tooth, in fact even a 60 tooth, and I do use this 40 tooth particularly. This is called a plywood blade, and typically if I'm doing some cross cutting or using plywood, I might use this in my table saw. Now what you get with this, of course, because it's only 7 1/4, it's a much quieter blade to run. You get much less sawdust. The thing that I really like is this is a very thin kerf. It's about half the kerf or even less than the table saw blade. So if you want to save lumber, maybe you have a shortage of lumber, or it's a specialty lumber and you want to cut very thin, you don't want to waste it on sawdust, this is the blade to use. So you can get it ripping or cross-cutting, either way, and it's a great alternative for another kind of blade that you can use in your table saw. What I have here is an Ankara miter gauge, and it's used for cross-cutting on the table saw. And what I want to show you here, if you undo these special screws here, you can move this fence back and forth. And I'll show you in a second why that's important. But you need a special wrench to do it. And this is the wrench that they give you. It's octagonal on the end so that it gets right in there. And of course, you see that it's long so that it reaches outside of this complex here. The problem is, where do you keep it? And what I finally have done, because I had this in a different part of where my miter gauge was stored, and I had to go looking for it anytime I wanted to move the fence. Here's what I've done. Put a couple of magnets. You can see there's one there and one there. And now that wrench lives, actually this way, it lives on the miter gauge all the time. It has never ever come off. And when I want to move that fence, I just pull that off and move it. So here's why you want to move that fence. So you can see right now that I've got a nice tight cut in here. But if if I decide that I'm going to be doing some cross cuts like that, look at the gap in here now, and that's why you might want to move that fence closer so that you get a little bit closer cut, a little bit more support on that. And that's why having that little wrench on the end or that little screwdriver on the end just makes life so much easier. So the other thing that I find from time to time, I need to make little pieces of wood that are 2 inches, 3 inches, 4 inches, whatever, and I need to make a series of them. Maybe I'm making picture frames and I need to make 3 or 4 picture frames and all of them are 8 by 10 inches, so I need to make a series of cuts. The best way to do that is to put a stopper in here, and what I really like to use for stopper is something called a magnetic switch, and some of you may not have heard of this. What it is a little tool that looks like this, and when you turn the handle on top, it locks onto a steel deck and it won't move. They come in a couple of different sizes. This is called the 90. This is called a 150. In a moment, I'm going to show you a couple of places that I use this, just so you get an idea. And the same thing, it locks on there. And when it's on there, you can't move it. Now, where I use this for a stop block here is depending on how far I need to cut a piece of wood. So for example, let's say I need to cut a bunch of 4 inches. I put it on the end of my fence, I drive it up like that, set it right there, and now I can move this back and forth anywhere and get it out of the way. So I can move this back here, lock that on. Now I can even take the fence right out of the way, and now I can go top it up there, make a cut. That will just sit up there. Then I move the next one, make the second cut, and so on and so on. So these are just super handy little tools. Let me show you a couple quick places that I use the bigger one right here. And there it is on my bandsaw fence, and I can move that around to any position that I want, back and forth, one of these on each side, and when I find a position, I lock both sides, and now that's super locked on there. And there's the same 2 magnetic switches that were on my bandsaw fence. Now I use them on my, and they live here semi-permanently, on my drill press, and that way I can move it around. I can move them back and forth. I can move it back here or up here, and I've got a fence. Once I drill enough holes in here, I just take and make another one. It only takes a few minutes, and again, these things lock down. This is such a super thing for safety on the drill press. So the last thing that I want to show you is something I call a saddle clamp. And a saddle clamp typically sits on top of, it's a jig that sits on top of the fence of your table saw. And it just sits like that, just drops on there like that. And if you look at the front of it, you'll notice that there are wing nuts. And the reason there's wing nuts on there, I used what's called a hanger bolt, which is wood thread on one side and bolt thread on the other side. I think in this one is a 1/4 inch. And so you drive it into the wood, and then you've got bolt thread hanging out, and that's why I can put wing nuts on there. And the purpose of wing nuts is because this is natural wood up here, and it can shrink and expand a tiny bit, and you always want to be able to have, you want to have it snug but not tight on there so that it stops. And because between summer and winter that wood can shrink and expand a tiny bit, you can use these wing nuts to tighten or loosen so that it always remains vertical and it always remains sort of snuggish to the saw. And I know a lot of you are going to wonder, what on earth you've got that hole in there for? Well, let me tell you. If I'm cutting something that's small, I can actually put a clamp in there, and there's a 2-inch piece of wood. It's a bit short, but you get the idea. I can put that in there like that, and now I can clamp that, and of course it would be down on the deck of the table saw here, probably, and I can run that through the saw, and if I'm making tenons, for example, I can take that off, turn it around the other way, and do the same thing on the other side and clamp that down there. If you don't want to use the hole, if you're not using the hole, if it's not, if the wood is bigger, you can often use you know, maybe put a clamp up here. If it's thicker, you might use it in different places. So lots of things. This is just a handy jig, and you can see all the different cuts that I've got in here, I've made in here. And it's always vertical, it's always handy, and it just does a great job. Well, that concludes my video today. All sorts of different things that I use around the table saw to make my life a little bit easier, but more than that, to make more accurate cuts on the table saw. And when you make accurate cuts on the table saw, all of your parts and pieces just come together, not only more conveniently, but everything seems to line up a lot better. I did a video, in fact, I think I've done a couple or maybe 3 videos on mag switches. I'll put a link to that. That'll show up probably down here somewhere. You'll be able to go and have a look at that. If you've never seen mag switches before, lots of different things that you can do with it. You might be interested in having a look. I'm Colin Canet for Woodwork Web. Thanks for watching.